two things that are happening to the people who did this crime, the officials. One is that the U.S., on 120 days after the 14th of December, the list will be published in the United States, which will name and shame them, ban their visas, and freeze their assets. The most important part of this exercise is the naming and shaming part, because what that does is other countries, even that haven't made conscious decisions or public decisions to follow the Magnitsky Act, will most likely not grant them visas as well. The other thing which is happening, which is independent from the political angle of this whole thing, is that we've gone after the money. We've spent 3.5 years working together with investigative journalists and other people in tracing the stolen $230 million. And we so far have found $135 million of it in 9 different countries, and we're working now with prosecutors from all those countries and freezing the assets and finding out where else the money went. And just this morning, the Moldovan government announced that they are opening a criminal investigation into the stolen money. The Swiss have frozen assets. The Lithuanians have frozen assets. And the beautiful thing about money is that it always leaves a trail. And we will find every last penny, and we will freeze every last penny, not for ourselves, but to take it away from the bad guys. And hopefully that will, and the other thing which will happen is, as that money gets frozen, other money will get frozen. And they are terrified. They're terrified. The chances of actually getting a piece of legislation passed in America is about 1 in a million. Literally 1 in a million. To come up with an idea to pass the Magnitsky Act and actually get it signed by the president is so small, so small. But because the story is almost biblical in its power, and because the Russians have done everything possible to make this happen, everything possible. The Russians have truly misbehaved in a shocking way at every step of the way to make this happen, that I actually believe that in spite of the economic connections between Europe and Russia, in the next 12 months, Russia will misbehave further in such a spectacular way that it's going to be similar to sanctions during apartheid. It'll become impossible for people not to do Magnitsky sanctions against Russia. And it's not so much based on my own advocacy. It's based much more on the way that the Russians will behave going forward that will cause people to do something. Given the preference of Russian criminals who work in the government to buy properties in France, I think you could be pretty well assured that at the end of the trail, some of the money will find its way into France and we'll find that money. But I can't say that with certainty today. The way that the U.S. law is written is that it goes after the people who were involved in the false arrest, torture, and death of Sergei Magnitsky, the financial crimes that he uncovered, the cover-up of those people as one big category. And then there was about 19 more words added to the law, which is, and all other gross human rights abusers in Russia. And in my own opinion, the treatment of Vasily Alexeyev was, by any measure, a gross human rights abuse. It's documented. And if there was one case beyond the Magnitsky case that's so clear to anybody else out there, it's his case. I can't tell you how the U.S. government is going to behave when they start publishing this list, but what I can tell you is that the people who worked with Vasily Alexeyev are extremely active in Washington looking after his interests, and I would hope very much that his the perpetrators of his death face the same type of justice as those who killed Sergei Magnitsky. And the answer is yes. We did think about it, we are thinking about it, and the mother of Sergei Magnitsky has filed in October of last year a case of wrongful death, torture, and other things at the European Court for Human Rights. But let me just make one comment about the European Court for Human Rights. And that is, it's nice to have a sort of Supreme Court above the national level. But it takes somewhere between 5 and 7 years for a case to be heard at the European Court for Human Rights. And when the case is heard, and in this case is sort of packed with a huge amount of compelling evidence, assuming that we win, which I'm assuming that we will, we'll get a judgment, not against Oleg Silchenko and Alexandra Gauss. We'll get a judgment against the Russian Federation. And the judgment in 7 years' time or 5 years' time will say that all sorts of terrible things were done that shouldn't have been done. And in the end, Sergei Magnitsky's mother will be awarded 50,000 euros. That's not justice. It might be helpful in terms of the findings of the court for other purposes, but that's not justice. As far as I'm aware, the trip of Francois Hollande to Russia is going to take place on the 28th of February. It would be our intention to get our supporters in the parliament to publicly challenge him to bring up the Magnitsky case, to call for immediate justice in terms of prosecuting the people who killed Magnitsky, and to call for an end to the posthumous prosecution of Sergei Magnitsky. I expect that will happen in advance of his trip, and how he decides to deal with that is obviously his choice, but this will certainly elevate the Magnitsky story in France to a different level because of this trip. The anti-Magnitsky law, it has literally blown up in the face of Putin. I spent 10 years living in Russia, and there's lots of things that were irritating about that, but one of the things that I liked about Russia and Russians is their love of children. There's no country that loves children as much as Russians do. And even the bad Russians, even the ones in the Putin regime, when they went after the children, that's when things really went truly off the rails. And I think it was probably Putin's biggest strategic mistake of the 12 years that he's been active in running Russia, is basically killing disabled orphans.